And here we are. Check it out. We're going to talk about IIS. And unfortunately, no, it's not the space station. It is Internet Information Services. So it's a web server, okay? Let's dig in. An IIS web server actually runs on the Microsoft .NET platform on Windows OS. While it's possible to run IIS on Linux and Macs using Mono, it's actually not recommended, and it's likely going to be unstable. There are other options, which we'll investigate a little bit later. But anyway, let's stick with Microsoft.NET IIS web server. It's versatile, it's stable, it's been widely used in production for many, many years. And version 10 happens to be the most current. So once it's installed, you're going to see this welcome page in your browser. Now, you and I both know that the internet is good, right? The internet cannot exist without web servers, though. But what exactly is a web server? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we've got to actually define it in the abstract so that we can have some context for how IIS fills the role. So you've got your generic web server. It's a process for hosting web applications. Right, so the web server allows an application to process messages that arrive through specific TCP ports by default. For example, the default port for HTTP traffic is 80, and the default port for HTTPS is 443. Now, usually when you visit a website in your browser, you don't have to, typically anyway, specify the port number, unless the web server is configured to receive traffic on ports other than the default. So if you visit http://www.example.com, this is going to send your request to port 80 by default, right? So you could specify the port number if you'd like, http://www.example.com:80, as well as for the HTTPS on port 443 for TLS, all right? That's the transport layer security. Assuming the default configuration in TLS is configured for your web application, see, the web server is going to receive all the inbound traffic on ports 80 and 443. What the web server does with the traffic from there on out will depend. And there are countless options for how the web server can process those requests. Well, now that you bring it up, the two main process models for web servers are to either handle all requests on a single thread or spawn a new thread for each request. Although the single thread model, Node.js for example, has some worker threads available, it typically only uses them for certain kinds of work, such as file system access. The thread per request model that IIS and its lightweight cousin IIS Express uses will grab a thread from a thread pool for each request. So web servers typically handle requests using a request-response pattern. The client sends a request and receives a response if it all goes well. HTTP protocol is the ubiquitous choice when communicating between a client and a web server over the internet. And of course, IIS is rich with features. Most commonly, though, IIS is used to host ASP.NET web applications and static websites. It can also be used as an FTP server, host WCF services, as well as be extended to host web applications built on other platforms, such as PHP. There are built-in authentication options, such as BASIC, ASP.NET, and Windows Auth. The latter one is useful if you have a Windows Active Directory environment. Their users can be automatically signed into web applications using their domain account. Other built-in security features include TLS certificate management and binding for enabling HTTPS and SFTP on your sites, request filtering for whitelisting or blacklisting traffic, authorization rules, request logging, as well as a rich set of FTP-specific security options. So one key feature of IIS that we're going to dig into here is the application pool. We're going to take a much closer look at the application pool because it is a critical component of the IIS process model. So an invaluable feature is remote management. IIS can also be managed via the CLI or using PowerShell. So if that's your thing, go ahead and script just about everything. So by now, you should have a pretty good impression about the configurability and the versatility of IIS. You should also be aware that it can be extended to serve, yeah, that's a pun, many purposes besides hosting ASP.NET apps. Through extension, IIS becomes a highly versatile and stable web server for Windows platforms. So why don't we just take a look now at how to install IIS on Windows 10. And by the way, the same process applies to Windows 7 and 8. Yeah, so calling it an install might be a little dramatic. After all, IIS is a feature in Windows. So what you really just need to do is enable the feature. So in Windows 10, you can press the Windows key and type turn Win, and you should see turn Windows features on or off. And then select it to open the Windows features dialog. And from here, you can turn on all sorts of additional features, including PowerShell 2.0, a deep directory tree of options for Internet Information Services, or IIS, which is what we've been talking about, and a subsystem for Linux. So Internet Information Services, IIS, this is the option that we're talking about. So just by clicking the box, it's going to give you a good starting point, yeah? You may, however, want to dig a little deeper. Worldwide Web Services, application development features, this is where you enable ASP.NET, CGI, and WebSocket Protocol. And you can always come back to these if you want to make some adjustments. To enable IIS on Windows Server, you can either use PowerShell or Server Manager to install the web role IIS. And then once you have all the desired IIS features selected, click OK. You get a fresh cup of coffee, and when you come back, it's hopefully done. And you can just go ahead and start using IIS GUI by typing IIS in the Windows search or by running Init Manager, INET-MGR. Now, before we get into many of these deeper details, just want to give you a little intro to IIS Manager. Highlighted some of the areas of interest because this thing is, it's a mess. It does take some getting used to, but there's a few things that I can draw your attention to. Maybe it'll help out. So first of all, you see 3 panes, right? The left has the connected servers. You can connect to remote servers as well, by the way. The middle pane, this is where you find all the features like application security, logging, filtering, redirecting. Or when you select Content View, you'll see the contents here in the middle instead, okay? Now, over here on the right is the Actions pane, and this changes depending on the selected context. Now, I'm not sure why that little extra icon at the bottom's right there, but you can actually resize the window down there too if you want. I'll give you a tip though, you can also right-click most of the icons and use the contextual menu to perform the most common actions. Now, if you expand the connection in the Connections pane, first thing you're going to notice is Application Pools. Well, hopefully it's the first thing anyway. Followed by Sites. Okay, so we're going to focus on those 2 in the next couple of sections. So here's a look at the application pools that are set up by default in IIS. And as you can see, there are combinations of 2.0 and 4.0 versions and of Classic and Integrated. Now, the integrated pipeline differs from the classic pipeline in that ASP.NET is integrated into the request pipeline of IIS. In classic mode, requests had to pass through one pipeline for IIS and another for ASP.NET. Integrated has been the preferred mode since IIS 7 was released with Windows Server 2008, as well as Vista. So don't use Classic unless you really have to. Now, the same can be said for version 2.0. They only are there for legacy support. In fact, if you don't need those application pools, you might as well just go ahead and remove them. We don't need any additional cruft hanging around, right? So a single application pool has 0 to many worker processes, w3wp.exe, and you can see what's running at any given time, and these worker processes run instances of your application. So once you're here in the Actions pane on the right side of the IIS window, just click Add Application Pool, and you can bring up the dialog. It's pretty straightforward, and you can usually just enter a name and press Enter or click OK. You can also add an application pool by right-clicking the Application Pools node in the Connections pane. And the tip from earlier actually proves its value already. If you were paying attention, you remember. It's okay. IIS is going to create a virtual user for each app pool. This is common nomenclature for application pool, okay? These worker processes run as the app pool's virtual user by default. Now, they can run as a different user, a domain account, for example, if they need special permissions. So even though I remove the app pools from the server, the virtual users live on. These virtual users still get their own standard folders, such as desktop, music, and pictures, and they don't chew up that much space, 110 megabytes. But once the app pool is removed, those user folders are cruft and can therefore then be deleted. One key feature of app pools is recycling. So by default, app pools recycle every 1,740 minutes. That's 29 hours, by the way, and when the configuration file changes. So you can actually configure recycling to suit your own needs. App pool recycling frees up the memory consumed by applications running in an app pool. So recycling can also prevent runaway processes from just eating up all the memory on your server. So then, what kinds of things are we talking about that actually use memory in your process? Everything on the stack and heap, static variables and properties, anything in the memory cache, any objects that are referenced by another object, any blocks of memory waiting to be garbage collected. You get the picture. But you can actually choose which events you would like to log or to not log. And as you can see, that is not the question. Not all options are shown in the previous dialog. See this? Runtime cycling events. Well, doesn't appear to be configurable. And this isn't entirely true. So a recycle starts a new process, then spins down the current process. The new process will, as you might expect, have a new PID. So you can change its behavior as well as recycling other behavior in advanced settings. In fact, you can actually edit any of the recycling configurations right here in this menu. So the recycling dialog is redundant in that respect, but you can just turn off recycling for config changes here. Probably don't want to, though. Your running app wouldn't get the config updates. You follow? Now, I do want you to make a note that overlapped recycle implies it is possible to have more than one instance of the application. So you should probably disable this only if your application requires it. Overlapped recycle just prevents disruptions that will occur if the recycle waited for the current process to drain requests before starting the new process. So, in other words, no new request would be handled until the current request completed or the configurable timeout period elapsed, which is typically 90 seconds because that's the default. All right? So there you go. Let's wrap it up. That's all about IIS Web Server. But there's more to learn. Stick around for the next video. I'll see you then.